Under the scorching Sahel sun, a convoy of trucks pulled up to a brand new artificial river in Burkina Faso. But they weren't delivering pumps, pipes, or any of the high-tech machines you'd expect. They were unloading cages, filled with live beavers. Yes, beavers. Animals almost no one in Africa had ever seen outside of a textbook. And in a region battling one of the harshest drought cycles on Earth, the move left both experts and locals asking the same question: why? Most countries in the Sahel turn to billion-dollar dams, imported filtration plants, or foreign aid to fight water scarcity. But here, a young president was betting the nation's future on an animal more at home in the Canadian wilderness than the African savanna. Was it genius? Or the most reckless environmental gamble in modern Africa? What happened next would ignite global ridicule, trigger local sabotage, and force a fight not just over water, but over who gets to decide how Africa saves itself. Before we dive in, I want to hear from you. If your country faced a crisis like this, would you trust nature or machines to fix it? Drop your thoughts in the comments, your own experiences, your own choices. Because in today's story, those choices aren't just personal, they shape the fate of entire nations. This is Africa Daily Good News, bringing you the real Africa. The part the headlines won't tell you, told for those who know the world is more connected than the evening news admits. To our viewers across America, Africa, and Europe, welcome back. If you're new here, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And now, let's go back to where this began. Before the beavers, before the river had a name. When water in Burkina Faso was more than just a resource, it was a weapon. For most people, the sound of a river is background noise. Something you hear on a camping trip, or when a faucet runs too long. But in the dry belt of Burkina Faso, an entire generation has grown up never hearing it at all. In some villages, children know the wind's whistle, but not the rush of water. According to UN data, over 60% of rural households here face critical shortages every single dry season. Over the past 50 years, surface water in the Sahel has declined by more than 20%. Entire communities have vanished, not from war but from thirst. Families leave behind cracked mud homes, walking away from land their grandparents farmed because the soil is too hard to dig and the wells yield nothing. Before the artificial river, water wasn't just scarce, it was currency. A tank of it could cost a farmer his cattle. A steady supply could cost a family their land, or worse, their daughters in marriage deals meant to secure survival. The math was cruel. Those who controlled water controlled life, and they knew it. This is where the paradox hits. In a world that can desalinate oceans and launch rockets to Mars, there were still villages in West Africa where a child's survival hinged on how far their mother could walk before the sun burned her strength away. If you live in a US city, you might think that kind of scarcity is impossible now. But scarcity isn't just a number, it's a power structure. It can exist anywhere, in any form, when control sits in the wrong hands. Traore stepped into power knowing he was inheriting more than a drought. He was inheriting a system where solutions came with strings. Foreign-built filtration plants with imported parts, billion-dollar dam loans tied to policy concessions. Consultants paid more than the farmers they were supposed to help. And when those systems failed, as they often did, the debt stayed long after the engineers flew home. Most leaders would take the safe route, sign the contracts, cut the ribbons, hope for applause. But he didn't. He proposed something that didn't fit the standard aid playbook. Dig a river from scratch using local labor, local materials, and no foreign money. No PR campaigns, no glossy brochures. Just a trench dug into the hard red earth meant to hold back the desert's advance. It was an idea simple enough for a child to understand, but dangerous enough for his political enemies to fear. Because if it worked here, it could work in Mali, Niger, Chad, and every place where water had been turned into a business model. And those who profited from that business were watching. In the first days of construction, the river was still just a scar in the ground. But people came anyway. Old men leaning on canes, young kids kicking up dust, women in bright wraps carrying jugs just to see what might be. They didn't come for speeches. They came to measure the distance between hope and reality. Because in a land this dry, hope can evaporate faster than water itself. By the time the first rains fell and the trench filled, the mood had shifted. Farmers planted again, cattle drank without restraint, children splashed where last year they'd been gathering dust in their hair. But beneath the surface, both of the water and the politics, there were already those working to make sure this river never lasted. And while the surface looked calm, the currents were already starting to pull in another direction. It's one thing to fight the desert, it's another to fight people who profit from it. From the moment the first excavators cut into the Sahel's dry crust, the project had enemies. Powerful contractors who'd made fortunes importing foreign-made purification machines called it a waste of resources. Foreign partners reminded Traore that Burkina Faso's debts left no room for unproven experiments. Even some in his own cabinet quietly warned that a self-funded river could drain the treasury and drain his political capital just as quickly. On paper, this was just a public works project. In reality, it was a direct threat to an entire industry built on selling water as a commodity. And industries don't surrender their markets, they fight for them. At first, the resistance was subtle. Opinion pieces in local papers questioning the cost. Radio hosts suggesting the plan was symbolic but useless. But soon, the blows came harder. Pumps vanished from construction sites. Cement bags were slashed open and left to ruin in sudden storms. A truckload of pipes from Ghana was hijacked on a remote stretch of road. One informant told government investigators, "If this project works, their business dies, and they are ready to kill for it." That wasn't hyperbole. Soldiers were deployed to guard the riverbanks. Night watchtowers appeared along the digging routes. In one ambush, 2 engineers were injured. In another, a young soldier drowned while defending a section of the canal from storm flooding. His funeral was quiet, but the message it carried was loud. This water war was already costing lives. The paradox was impossible to ignore. A project designed to give water freely was being attacked by those who feared its success more than they feared the drought. And here's where it forces a question. If an idea this simple can provoke this much hostility, what does that say about who really controls survival in a crisis? In the months that followed, the trench became a river. The first flow brought farmers back to their fields, revived grazing lands, and filled storage tanks without the toll of debt. But under that surface calm, the opposition was adapting. They knew the best time to undermine a project is not when it's dry. It's when people start depending on it. For many Americans watching from a distance, it's tempting to imagine that once the water runs, the battle is over. But according to development researchers, infrastructure without control is just an invitation for someone else to take it. In Burkina Faso, the next challenge wasn't digging deeper into the earth. It was keeping what had been created from falling back into the same cycle of dependency that had plagued it for decades. And as the dry season returned, the river's first real test arrived. Not from the desert, but from within its own waters. A river can be built in months, but it can turn hostile in weeks. Barely a year after the artificial river began flowing, the problems crept in quietly. Then, all at once, silt and debris settled in the channels, slowing the current. Shallow pools formed where the water no longer moved, breeding swarms of mosquitoes. In some stretches, a slick green layer of algae spread across the surface, suffocating fish and staining the water with a bitter taste. Villages downstream reported stomach illnesses. Others simply refused to drink from it. In theory, the solutions were obvious. Industrial dredgers to clear the sediment, chemical treatments to kill the algae, imported pumps to keep the water moving. But every one of those options came with a price tag and a dependency clause. Fuel shipments from abroad, spare parts only sold by foreign suppliers, maintenance contracts that would bleed the treasury for decades, exactly the trap the project had been built to escape. Traore's advisors pushed for the safe fix. His critics waited for him to fold. But he didn't. Instead, he turned to a solution so unorthodox it bordered on reckless. Replace the machines with animals, not camels to carry water, not fish to eat the algae, but a species with no history in West Africa, the beaver. In North America and Europe, beavers are known as ecosystem engineers. They cut wood, build dams, slow currents, and create natural filters. Studies show their wetlands can increase biodiversity by more than 80%. improve water quality without electricity, and hold water in dry seasons like a living reservoir. To most engineers, that's impressive. To most politicians, it's a public relations nightmare. Because here's the unspoken truth. If a few hundred rodents could maintain a river better than million-dollar machinery, it would expose just how bloated and unnecessary much of the water management industry really is. And industries built on crisis rarely survive when the crisis disappears. The gamble raised uncomfortable questions. Would an invasive species upset the ecosystem? Could they survive the Sahel heat? And perhaps the biggest one? Was this science or desperation? If you've ever faced a problem so urgent that you chose the option no one else would dare, you know the weight of that decision. When the wooden crates arrived at the riverbank, there were no speeches, no media crews. Just the sound of latches opening, and the first beavers sliding into the water with barely a ripple. Children watched from the banks, half curious, half confused. Some laughed. Others whispered that the president had finally lost it. But change doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it begins in silence, in the way a current shifts, in the way an old problem meets an unexpected answer. And in the days ahead, the river would start to show signs that something new was taking root beneath its surface. At first, the Beaver plan was a punchline. Western outlets mocked it as Disneyland in the desert. A French talk show ran a skit of a cartoon beaver in sunglasses, saving Africa with a bucket. Opposition radio hosts joked that the president was building a zoo, not a water system. And yet, no one could explain why, if the idea was so absurd, it was drawing so much effort to discredit it. In the early weeks, nothing dramatic happened. The animals explored the banks, gnawed at branches, disappeared underwater. But within months, small dams began appearing in the bends of the river. Water that had once sat stagnant began to trickle and sparkle in the sun. Sediment dropped harmlessly behind the dams instead of clogging the main channels. Grass grew thicker along the banks, holding the soil in place. And with the plants came insects. With the insects came birds. And with the birds came fish. For the people living along the river, the change wasn't abstract. It was daily life. Women noticed the water tasted cleaner. Fishermen returned to stretches they'd abandoned. Children no longer woke to clouds of mosquitoes outside their doors. It's a universal truth. When a resource becomes easier to access, daily behavior shifts without anyone announcing it. Even in the US, most people rarely think about their water source unless it fails. But in places like this, you notice every improvement because it saves you time, money, and sometimes your health. That's why the shift in tone from local villagers mattered more than any foreign headline. Where they had once rolled their eyes, they now guarded the beavers, planting trees to give them building material, warning outsiders not to disturb their dams. Still, skepticism didn't vanish overnight. Some wondered if this was just a lucky season. Others feared the animals might vanish in the next drought. But quietly, the river was writing its own argument. Not through reports or press releases, but through results that could be seen, touched, and tasted. And as the second rainy season approached, the story of the beavers was about to spread far beyond the riverbanks, carried not by officials or foreign media, but by those who lived beside the water every day. It wasn't a government press release that changed the conversation. It was a shaky 20-second video shot on a cheap phone. Rain poured down over the artificial river. A single beaver, half submerged, worked furiously to patch a dam as water roared around it. Someone posted it online with the caption, "Nature fights for us. Why don't we fight for her?" Within days, the clip had been shared across West Africa, translated into English, Arabic, Portuguese. Diaspora communities in Paris, New York, and Toronto reposted it with pride. What the glossy foreign documentaries had ignored, a raw piece of citizen footage, had turned into a rallying cry. For years, international coverage of African infrastructure followed a formula: foreign funding, foreign experts, foreign branding. This river had none of that, and that absence was exactly what made it dangerous to the status quo. If a locally built, nature-driven project succeeded here, it could expose how much of the aid industry depended on keeping solutions foreign. On the ground, the mood shifted. Farmers who'd been quiet now spoke openly to local reporters about cleaner water and healthier crops. School teachers added beaver ecology to their lessons, framing it not as an imported curiosity, but as part of the country's survival story. It's a pattern that human behavior experts have noted worldwide. Once people see themselves in a solution, they defend it more fiercely than if it's handed to them. That's not to say the skepticism disappeared. In the US, some commentators dismissed the project as a feel-good story without hard economic proof. But in Burkina Faso, the economics were already showing in the simplest ways. Fewer hours spent fetching water, lower medical costs from waterborne disease, more fields producing food. Those are metrics you don't need a spreadsheet to understand. You can feel them in your body. By the time the second rainy season ended, the footage wasn't just proof of survival, it was proof of momentum. And momentum, once it starts rolling, is the hardest thing for any opponent to stop. It wasn't the loud critics that worried Traore most, it was the ones who suddenly stopped talking. Western media outlets that had mocked the project a year earlier went quiet. Development agencies that had ignored the river now began holding closed-door discussions about biodiversity models in the Sahel. And in the background, sponsored articles started appearing, crediting unnamed international partnerships for the success. For the people who had dug the river with their own hands, this wasn't just revisionist history, it was theft in slow motion. They saw the same pattern play out before. An African idea works, then outsiders rebrand it until the origin is blurred. Local journalists who reported the real story felt the pressure too. A community radio station in Ouagadougou lost its license a week after airing an interview with a farmer praising the beavers. The official explanation was technical violations. Off the record, it was clear. Certain voices weren't meant to be amplified. Yet the river's transformation was impossible to hide. Drone footage from youth collectives showed miles of green where there had been cracked earth. Water clarity tests from independent hydrologists in Ghana confirmed a 72% improvement in just 3 months. Fish stocks rose by over a third. These weren't talking points. They were facts anyone could see. Facts that didn't need a press release to be believed. For many Americans following the story, it echoed a familiar dynamic. When grassroots success challenges an entrenched system, that system doesn't always try to destroy it outright. Sometimes it tries to own it. And owning a narrative can be more dangerous than opposing it because people stop questioning who truly benefits. In Burkina Faso, the people living along the banks knew the truth. They had seen the first trenches carved in dust, had tasted the water before and after, had watched the beavers work through the night. To them, this was not a foreign gift. It was theirs. And as the river's third year approached, that sense of ownership would lead to something no one had predicted. A public stand, not just for the water, but for the right to tell their own story. They didn't hire a PR firm. They didn't print banners. Yet on the river's third anniversary, thousands showed up anyway. Farmers came in their work clothes, soldiers in faded uniforms, school children carrying homemade flags. Along the water, small wooden boats drifted past, each flying the colors of a different African nation. No foreign dignitaries, no VIP seating, just people standing shoulder to shoulder on the banks of something they had built together. By then, the numbers were undeniable. Biodiversity up, water clarity dramatically improved, fish populations rebounding. But what mattered more than the statistics was that people saw those changes with their own eyes. The mother who no longer walked hours for water. The fisherman who'd sold his first fresh catch in years. The child who learned to swim in a river his parents thought would never exist. From the stage, a simple wooden platform, Traore didn't give a technical speech. He didn't even mention the critics. He looked at the crowd and said, "They told us it couldn't be done. They told us it was foolish, but the river is here. And so are we." It wasn't a boast. It was a reminder that ownership is not granted, it's claimed. There's a universal pattern here. When people in any country, whether in West Africa or small-town America, feel they've built something themselves, they will defend it longer, harder, and more fiercely than any outsider expects. And that defense often begins not with confrontation, but with quiet, collective pride. In the weeks after the celebration, more villages began planting along the tributaries. Youth groups volunteered to monitor beaver habitats. Teachers made river visits part of their curriculum. It wasn't just environmental restoration anymore. It was cultural identity tied to a living, moving body of water. The irony was sharp. The most effective counter to years of foreign narratives wasn't a government campaign. It was a living ecosystem doing its work in plain sight. And as that ecosystem strengthened, it set the stage for something even larger, a blueprint that other nations were beginning to notice. 2 years after the first beaver touched Sahel water, the river was no longer just a national project. It had become a case study. Delegations from Mali, Niger, Benin, even Kenya came to walk its banks. Environmental summits in Addis Ababa and Nairobi cited it as a viable model for drought resilience. And quietly, agencies that had once ignored it began asking for technical details, a polite way of saying, "How did you pull this off without us?" The data was clear. Water clarity up 72%, fish stocks up 38%, 14 bird species returned. But numbers don't tell the whole story. The most valuable change was in how people saw themselves. Farmers began calling the river ours, not the government's. Children learned to track beaver activity like sports scores. Local markets revived as waterborne disease rates dropped, freeing families from medical bills that had drained them for decades. Observers abroad struggled with the same contradiction, that a solution dismissed as naive could outperform multi-million-dollar infrastructure. In the US, some analysts drew parallels to small-town water co-ops that outlasted privatized systems, noting that when communities manage their own resources, maintenance becomes a shared habit, not a budget line. According to behavioral research, when people believe they are custodians instead of customers, they protect assets at a level no contract can enforce. Still, there was resistance. Some international reports reframed the success as a partnership project, downplaying its fully local origin. Others suggested scaling it only with outside funding, an ironic twist given the river's purpose was to prove independence. Yet inside Burkina Faso, there was no debate. They knew who dug it, who protected it, and who risked everything to keep it flowing. Standing on the bank during a school visit, Traore told the children, "We did not build this river for ourselves alone. We built it for those who will come after us. It must remain pure, alive, and free, just like our people." And in the crowd, a boy no older than 10 raised his hand and said, "Then we'll take care of it." The beaver dams kept holding. The grass stayed green. And in a world where drought headlines rarely carry hope, this river now carried something else. Proof that survival doesn't always need permission. Most infrastructure projects fade from memory once the ribbon is cut. They become background, another line in a budget, another structure in the landscape. But this river refused to fade. It kept moving, breathing, feeding life into places the maps had already written off as barren. 3 years ago, its banks were lined with skeptics. Today, they are lined with fishermen, farmers, and children who've never known what it's like to go without a full bucket. For them, the transformation isn't just visual, it's generational. Where scarcity once dictated behavior, abundance now shapes it. Families plan crops without fear of mid-season collapse. Market stalls sell fresh fish where, not long ago, they sold bottled water. Across the ocean, the story resonates for a different reason. In the US, where water systems are often managed far from the communities they serve, the idea that a group of determined people could build and sustain their own lifeline challenges a deeply held assumption. That control must come from the top down. If people can take back that control here, in one of the harshest climates on Earth, where else might it work? The lesson isn't just about beavers or Burkina Faso. It's about the quiet power of ownership, of standing on the bank of something you've built and knowing it will still be here when you're gone. Because when survival is shared work, its rewards are shared too. And in a world where so many solutions are sold instead of shared, maybe that's the most radical act of all. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, subscribe and stay with us. There's more the headlines won't show you.